Welcome to Train Signal, and you're watching video number 6 in our Administering SQL Server 2008 course. And in this video, we'll be focusing on security. How do you keep your data safe? So what are we going to cover in this video? First thing I want to do is give you a bird's eye view or a high-level view of SQL Server security. When you're talking about securing a SQL Server database, you're talking about a big topic. Much more than we want to try and tackle in a 1 hour or 2 hour video. But even though we won't be able to get in there and get our hands on every single aspect of SQL Server security, I do want to at least have you come away from this video with an understanding of some of the other areas and some of the other issues and some of the other interfaces to be aware of. So we'll talk about some of those. The bulk of what we will talk about in this video will be managing user access. We'll talk about what do you need to create as far as user accounts and logins and organizing resources to allow you to better allocate them to individuals or groups of individuals. When you think in terms of protecting your data, what comes to mind? I mean, for some people it might just be user accounts, making sure that only the right people have access to that data. But protecting your data can mean a lot more than just user accounts. And then we'll talk about best practices. As a SQL Server database administrator, you'll have a lot of different options as far as what you can do to secure your SQL Server database. Well, in that long list, there's a few things that should be pretty close to the top of that list. We want to point those out. But starting with the SQL Server security landscape, what does that include? Well, first of all, some things we'll cover in more detail, but limiting access to the database itself. Now, that can mean a lot of different things. That can mean user accounts, that can mean logins when you're talking SQL Server, and we'll differentiate between users and logins when we get into that. It can mean who can access the server remotely, who can access the server locally at that particular workstation, internet access. When you log into the database, what can you do? Because there's the concept of limiting access to the database and within the database. Now, SQL Server, you can liken it to an apartment complex where you've got multiple units that have secondary or additional security to get into the unit. So you may have access to get into the apartment complex, but that doesn't necessarily give you access to all the units. The same thing is true with SQL Server. If you think of the SQL Server database engine as the apartment complex, and then an individual database is like a unit or an apartment or a condo, if you want to go condo, right, inside of SQL Server. Now, in many production environments, you'll only have one production database on the server, but even so, if there's only one production database, if you remember from the previous video on the different databases in SQL Server uses various system databases just to manage itself. So there will always be other databases in addition to your production database. So we want to be able to limit access to those other databases. Well, they say no man is an island, and the same thing is true for your SQL Server database. Never will it be an island. The whole point is to make data available to people, whether directly or indirectly through applications. So you're going to have some points to consider regarding your network access security. And we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll play around with our firewall and punch a hole in there to let SQL Server's configuration manager get through, as well as the management studio. So we'll get a chance to see some of that and talk about some of that. Another concept is applications that need to access SQL Server. So you have a user who's ultimately retrieving information, but very indirectly. They have some desktop application or web application that they're using, and as far as they know, it could be any database in the background, but it's SQL. What are some of the issues that need to be considered when you're dealing with an application, especially an application that's using the common language runtime to access information inside of SQL Server? That is a science in of itself, but it's one you do want to be aware of if you've got application developers doing CLR integration development against your SQL Server database. And then there's the also important, yet oftentimes overlooked aspect of simple physical security. I mean, is your server protected from fires or floods or any of those type of physical disasters, earthquakes? Heaven forbid, right? Now, when it comes to security from those types of things, you're really talking backups more than anything else because, there's nothing else you can do with that but restore the server somewhere else. So we'll talk about backups in a later video. But what about theft? If someone can get to your physical server, hey, all bets are off. There's a lot that can be done once you can get to the server, especially if you can take it off-site and have unlimited access to the server. Now, at this point, you're just hoping that the effort it takes to break into that server is far greater than the value of the information on the server. And that's typically a good rule of thumb when you're looking at security. How valuable is this information? And then based on that, will determine how far you need to go with your implementation of your security. So let's talk about managing users. I have 4 main things I'm going to cover, not necessarily perfectly in that order, because the permission stuff is going to get rolled in to some degree. But we want to talk about logins and users in SQL Server. They're not the exact same thing. They're both needed in order to have access to the data, and we'll talk about that, and we'll create one. And then we'll talk about server and database roles. If you're familiar with creating user accounts or managing user accounts in Windows at all, the concept of user accounts and then creating groups to put those user accounts into to help manage them is a familiar concept. That's what this is about in SQL Server. Instead of calling it groups, however, we simply call them roles, server roles and database roles, and we'll talk about some of the differences. And then database permissions come as a result of those first 2 bullet points, so we'll play around with that a little bit. And then the last thing in this section, I want to talk to you a little bit about schemas. You'll see schemas popping up as we're going through it, but I'm going to wait until after we've done some basic stuff with logins and roles, and then we'll jump into the schema stuff. But starting with logins and or maybe versus users. But we're talking basically people, for the most part, to start with. You know, these folks who smile and come and request things of you and inundate you with requests, and they love you when you're on target and you find their data or fix their problems, but don't let something go wrong. You may be a little bit less popular then. Well, that's what we're here to serve, though, right? We're here to serve people. And whether it be directly or through an application, ultimately it's still people. Now the difference is you can have an individual login or you can have a login that's used by an application. And there are some differences, and we'll talk about some of those. And then a third case of logins and users refers to SQL Server services themselves. If you remember back to the installation process, we actually had to assign a user account. I just did administrator for all of them, but we had to assign a user account to the various SQL Server services, and then those services run with the permissions that you grant to that account. Part of the reason for that is some of the SQL Server services may need to communicate across your network. Let's say you have a domain with multiple servers and they need to communicate. Then that service needs to run with the proper network credentials to communicate across your network. But with that said, let's go ahead and actually create a user account. So I'm going to switch over to my SQL Server box. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new account. Now, since we're dealing with Windows authentication, I'm going to create this account in Windows Active Directory. Going to my Start menu, if I go to Administrative Tools, Active Directory Users and Computers. Now, I'm running on Windows 2008. If you're on 03, most of this will be the same. And yours may not be expanded yet. It may look like that, but you'll want to expand that and get to the Users folder. And if you right-click on Users, there's a new option. Go to User. And here I can go about giving some information for a new user account. I'll just give her a first name. Don't need to deal with the last name at this point. Put in user login. Click Next. Need to give it a password. I'll need to be consistent with whatever restrictions are placed on passwords by Windows itself. So make sure you give it a good password. Go ahead and clear out the checkboxes. Since this user isn't going to really exist, I don't care about them changing their password. I am that user. Click Finish. And I've got my new Amy account. Now, another thing I need to do because of the environment I'm in, I need to also allow Amy to log in locally at this server. Now, the first step is across the board. You'll need to do that if you're dealing with Windows authentication. The second step you probably won't need to do unless you've got users logging into the actual physical computer where your database is running. Now, most of you probably are not. So this next step wouldn't apply. But since I'm in a test environment and everything's on one box, I need to allow Amy to log in locally. So I go back to my Start menu. Go to Administrative Tools again. This time I need to go to Group Policy Management. Clicking on that. Expand my domain. Mine is melsdomain.local. Yours will be whatever domain you've created. Expand the domains folder. Keep going through Mel's domain. Go to Domain Controller, expand that, and then Default Domain Controller Policy. Right-click on that and select Edit. This one right here. And then I get to expand some more stuff. Under Computer Configuration, expand Policies, Window Settings, Security Settings, one more, Local Policies, and now click on User Rights Management. And notice here, pretty close to the top, Allow Log On Locally. Double-click on that, and here's a list of the user accounts that can currently log on locally at this machine. Administrators is on the list, and that's why I've been able to log in all this time, thank goodness. But I need to add Amy, or at least some group that Amy is a part of. So if I click on Add User or Group, and I'm going to browse and go to Advanced and then hit the Find Now and let it give me a list of user accounts. So we can see Amy here. I've added her to Active Directory. But like I said, I could add Amy or I could add a group. And since I'm not too picky right now and I want to make life easy, I'm going to add a group that already exists that Amy is already a part of. Because typically you would work with adding a group. Now you typically wouldn't add the Everyone group. That's a built-in group. But that's getting into Windows admin stuff. But for now, just to allow Amy to get in and then any other users I create to get in, we'll just add the Everyone group. Click OK. OK again. Third time. Fourth time. If I go back and double check, the Everyone group is on the list. So I'm good to go on that. Now that change doesn't actually take place though until I reboot. But we won't bother with rebooting until we go to log in as Amy. At that point, I'll not just log off, but I'll restart my server. So now I've taken care of the Windows stuff I need to do. First of all, I created her user account in Active Directory. Second, because I'm working in an environment where everything's on one computer and my users are logging in on this computer, and only because of that, I had to allow Amy to log in locally. But now I move into the SQL Server specific stuff. First of all, I need to create a login, and second of all, I need to create a user account. And we'll talk about what the difference is as we get in there and do it. But going to your Start menu, SQL Server Management Studio, I'm logging in as administrator. Here's my Populated Object Explorer. I've got a databases folder with the various databases I've created. Now you may have your Veronica's database there from the previous exercises. I actually refreshed my computer. I get to do that. And I've blown mine away. But using the scripts that you have available to you, just in case you blew yours away, you can recreate those. And I'm going to go ahead and recreate those in a second. But before I even go there, I'll just expand and look at some of the databases that are already there. Under the Report Server database, notice there is a security folder. Under the Report Server Temp DB, it also has a security folder. And just about every database that I've ever seen under SQL has a security folder. Right? There's one under the master. But in addition to the security folder associated with each database, there is a security folder associated with the instance of SQL Server. If I expand that one, and we'll start there, it says logins under that security folder. And here's a list of all the logins that can log into this server. Now here's the difference between logins, what I'm going to create here, and users, which is what we're going to create under the databases folder. Logins get you into the server, but don't get you into any of the databases. You need a user that has access to one of the databases to get you into the database. It's sort of like I could give you a key to my apartment complex that only lets you into the lobby and maybe the exercise facilities. But if you want to get into my actual apartment in my building, not that I really live in an apartment building, but if I did, right, you would need possibly a second key to get into my unit versus my next door neighbor's unit. Same thing here in SQL. Logins get you into the apartment, so to speak. They get you into the server, but you don't have access to a database until I specifically give you a user account that is linked to a database. So let's go ahead and create a login. I don't need that open to do it. Just right-click on the login folder. There's a new login option. And I'm going to pull this login from Active Directory. So once I get into SQL, it'll allow me to search Advanced find now, and it's pulling up everything it finds in Active Directory. There's Amy, and I do want to specifically add Amy for now. I'm not going to deal with adding the everyone at this point. Click OK, but I could do that. Click OK again. And there's Amy in Mel's domain. Now, default database is currently set to master. I haven't recreated my Veronica's databases, but normally you would want to set that default to point to the database that Amy's going to be working with. So I'm going to click OK for now. And we're going to jump over here and actually recreate those Veronica databases. I can do that by going to File, Open File, and you should have that copied to your C drive in the root. You should have a Course Files folder. Copy that from the CD if you haven't done it. Under Course Files, you'll have folders for the various videos. This is video 6. So double-click that, and these two scripts, Create Veronica DB and Create Veronica's, we want to rerun both of those. I'll double-click the first one. Once that populates, click Execute. And while it's running, I can go grab the second one. Open, File, grab the second one, and go ahead and click Execute on that one as well. The second one finished. I'll go ahead and expand this. I did get one error message. The only error message, however, is that it can't drop the existing Veronica's database because it doesn't exist. And that's totally fine. This script starts out with a drop statement to delete the database if it was already there. That way you can refresh your database. This was kind of the thinking with these scripts. And then going over to the second one, same thing. I get a cannot drop statement. But other than that, and this one actually inserted data in the database. All those additional files you saw in the folder, it used those to populate the tables. All right? So I've got two databases now under my user databases, that is, under my databases folder. Now you don't see them yet because I just added them. If I refresh by right-clicking on databases, go to refresh, and voila, there's Veronica's and Veronica's. Maybe we should come up with another name, but I'm kind of partial to that one, so I'm sticking with it. Tables, expand that, and I can see my 5 tables that are part of my database. I can actually pull data back from them if I right-click on, say, Customers, select Top 1,000 Rows, just click on that, and it'll run it. It'll build the query and run it for me really quickly, which is kind of nice. And I can see, yep, I got data in there. So I'm all set. Now I can go back and, first of all, before I get into creating my user, I'm going to blow all this away. I don't like having too much open. I'll even close this stuff down too. Before I go in and create my user, I'm going to first go back and fix that login, or at least partially fix it. We're going to do this in phases. And if I go back to Amy down here under logins, double click, and I want to change her default. I don't want her monkeying around with my master database by default. If you recall, the master database is the primary database that SQL Server uses to manage itself. It keeps a record of what are the other databases, user information, all that kind of stuff is saved in your master. So you don't want that to be her default. Now, if I don't give her access to it, it could be her default and she wouldn't be able to do anything with it anyway. But you want to set the default to the database that she's going to be working with. So I'll click OK. Now let's go to the database itself, expand that security folder, and there's a users folder. Once again, even though I made this her default, even if I refresh it, she's not there yet. I have to specifically add her here as well. So clicking on New User, login name. This login name and username, or username and login name, whichever you want to go, they don't have to match. Now, if you like making things extra hard, you can make them different, but in our case, I'll leave them the same. Now, there is some method, there is some reason to that. You could have a login that gets you into the server that you use for multiple people, and they have individual user accounts within, but for what we're doing, the two of them should just match. So I'll just click on the ellipse here. Once again, doing browse, and I'm pulling that login from SQL. Click OK. Click OK again. So that login is the Amy and Mel's domain that's already been allowed access to SQL. And there's some other things down here. Schemas, we'll get back to schemas in a bit. And there's also roles. We'll leave roles alone for now as well, because I want to show you what goes wrong by not selecting a role, then we'll come back and play around with that. So I'll click OK. Amy is good to go. She can log into the database. I like minimizing things when I'm done, so I'll close all those down. And with that, we're ready to do our reboot. So I'll go ahead and reboot my server. And '08 wants me to tell it why, and that's my reason. I'm not telling you. And I will see you as soon as this reboot finishes. So I'm back after my reboot. Go ahead and log in as Amy. Control-Alt-Delete. I need to switch users. Remember, we are logging in as Amy now because we're using Windows off. Put in that. Put in my password. Now this is a brand new account I've just created for Amy, so it might take a few seconds. Now, so we're into Windows. Next, we want to get into SQL. See what we can do. Go Start, All Programs, SQL '08. There's my Management Studio. Since this is Amy's first time into SQL, it actually takes a little while to let her in. So I'll just kind of fast forward you guys past this and come right back after this is done. So I'm in. Sort of. Now I need to log in. Let's see if my login actually worked. Click Connect. And there's my Object Explorer, so I'm definitely in. Expand the Databases folder. I can see all the databases. I can look inside the Security folder. I've given her access to look around the apartment building. I added her to Veronica, so I can expand that. She can't see tables. Or system tables. Expanding views. She can see system views. These are built-in freebies that the system creates that allow you to see things about the data, such as, we didn't talk about these yet, but here's one that'll give me all the columns and all the tables for this database. So I should be able to right-click on that, select 1,000 rows, and see all the columns. Let's see what I get. 0 rows returned. It's as if the database is empty as far as Amy is concerned. But we know it's not empty because we just saw it and actually saw some of the data over on the other side. What about the Veronicas? We didn't give her any access to this one at all. Try expanding that one. She has no access to it all. She can see nothing inside that database. So it looks like we did give her a pass to get inside the apartment, but maybe all the drawers and closets are locked or something. And basically that's exactly it. Even though we let her get into the database, we didn't say, well, what can she do? Can she insert data? Can she read data? Can she delete? What are we going to let her do? We haven't given her any specific rights or permissions within the database. So that moves us into our discussion of roles. We haven't actually put her in a role. Now, I should back that up a little bit. You could actually allow Amy specifically to have various rights and permissions to a database. That's not recommended, though. Administratively, that's a pain in the neck. You almost always want to assign rights and permissions, privileges to a group, or in this case, when you're talking SQL, it's a role, and then add user accounts to those roles. So we'll get out of the Veronica. She has no access to that at all. And we need to switch back over to my admin account. So I'm going to do that. So here I'm back. Switch user again. Other user, this time it's administrator. Give it a password. So I'm back in as administrator. If I go to Start, SQL Server Management Studio, go ahead and connect, and I ultimately want to go back to that user account. So go to Databases, Veronica's, Security folder, Users, double-click on Amy, and let's talk about the lower half of this screen. Roles. By adding her to, say, an access admin or a backup operator, I'm giving her permissions specific to a different role that she could play within the organization. So let's say I just want her to be able to read and write data. There's a DB reader and a DB writer role. Adding her to both those roles gives her access to do exactly what those roles say. So I can click OK now. And let's switch back over to Amy's account. I'll close this. So I'm back in as Amy. Should probably change the desktop wallpaper so we can have different, make it obvious who we are. But you can see right here, where's Amy now? Go to SQL Server Management Studio again. Go ahead and connect. Should go a lot faster this time. Go to databases, go Veronica's, expand tables, and I've got tables. So she didn't have any access to read or write data, so I just basically hid all the data from her at first. So now she can do things like right-click on customers, select the top 1,000 rows, right? Expand that. She can insert new data. Here, I have some queries laying around. We'll grab one of those. I'll close this. We'll need that. File, open, file. Once again, if you go to your C drive, assuming you copied yours to the same location I did, you really need to. Course files, video 6, and under sample SQL, there's an inserts file. Just double click on that, and we're going to use a portion of it. We don't need all of it. This first statement here will insert a new row into the database, and this second statement will actually turn around and select that row so that we can see it was actually added. So if I ran it first, I get no results, 0 rows. We haven't inserted it yet. But I'll run it in conjunction with the insert statement. Just highlight that, click execute, and it inserts and immediately runs and pulls back that record. Very cool. Then I can go about deleting it as well. So I'll just open a new window. And I'm going to avoid writing SQL. If I right-click on customers again, script table as, and if I go to delete to, tell it to put it in I'll go ahead and put it in a new query window. Didn't need to create my own in that case. Let me skip back over there and get that number. There you go. I have an extra one open, so I didn't need that. I closed it down. But if I go back and get that number, we added a new customer number, 39,600. Control C, I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to delete where customer number is on the list. Hit tab to select that. Is equal to, and I need this in single quotes because of the way my data is defined as all strings. Where customer number is equal to 39,600. Execute that. It says 1 row affected, so it looks good. If I go back to the previous window here, if I try and do a select again, just selecting that portion of the code, highlighting that portion of the code, hit execute, and I get 0 rows again. So Amy was able to see the data, query the data, insert new data, and delete data because I gave her write and read permission. All right? Now, what if we want to more finely tune that? And we don't want her to be able to say delete. Let's say we have someone doing data entry and we don't want them to ever delete anything, whether it be on purpose or by accident. So we want to take away the ability to delete. Let's go back over to the administrator side and tweak this a little further. Don't need to save these. We can recreate them, so I'll say no. So I'm back in as admin. Start Server Management Studio. Connect. Go back to databases, Veronica's, security, users, double click on Amy. And if you go to securables, currently there's nothing listed, but using search, I can tell it what types of specific objects I want to allow specific access levels to. Let's try it. If I say, for example, all objects of certain types, click OK, it lists some of the different objects available under SQL. So the database itself is an object, stored procedures, tables, views, a lot of different things that are considered objects under SQL. Basically everything is considered an object under SQL these days. But click on tables, because we're only going to focus on tables for now. Click OK, and I get a list of all the tables, and now I can specifically grant, say, insert, delete, update, etc. to a table, or I can deny those things. So if I specifically deny her delete permission, she should no longer be able to delete anything, but all the other permissions will still be there. And I'll do that for all the tables. Client flower, so I don't want her taking anything out of my database. You can put things in. And orders. Can't delete anything. Now, in some cases, I might specifically want her to be able to say delete an order and not delete a customer, or be able to delete a flower type from the database. I could do it on an individual table by table basis, but I'm going to do all of them for now. Click OK. Once again, we're going to switch users back over to SQL under Amy. So we're back as Amy. Start SQL Server Management Studio. Connect. And I'm going to go and grab my scripts right away. File, open, file. And I want this insert script again. Should be able to run this first portion just fine. Now, if you didn't do the delete, by the way, this insert will fail because we have a rule that says you can't have the same customer number twice. So just FYI on that. Click execute, and I was able to reinsert Mary, and just kind of show you that. If you tried to do this twice, you should get an error message, FYI. Right? Because it's already there. So if you're seeing that, it means you need to delete that record out of there. Okay? So I've reinserted the record. I've queried it to see that it really is there. I did a lookup based on email address. Right? So I know it's there. I could have done a lookup based on customer number. Either one would be fine. And then we actually created a SQL statement to do the delete. And I'm just one, as you can tell, who avoids typing whenever possible. So I'm going to do the same thing again. Right click, script table as delete to, new query editor window. And I just need to change this portion. The customer number is equal to 39600, semicolon, execute it, and no go this time. The permission was denied on the object. So she still had the ability to insert, to query. So if you need to do reporting, if you need to add new information as she's coming across new customer information, she can do that. But deletes, you could have that handled by maybe a database administrator. In many environments, they choose to never delete information out of a database. What you might do instead is have a separate column where you flag it as being quote unquote logically deleted. Is a good design concept in many environments, and that way you can preserve your data against possible accidental deletions by really never allowing anything to be deleted physically, only logically. And then maybe over time, if the volume of logically deleted records becomes a hindrance to your performance, you could then have an administrator move that stuff off to another location. All right? So there, we've actually gone in and created a user account and played around with assigning roles to give this particular user various permissions. So now I do want to finish up with a little more discussion on those roles. So let's go back over to the slides and finish on a discussion of roles. When we talk about roles, we're talking about two main types at least of roles. You have your server level roles, which are applied to the entire server. So for example, I have a sysadmin server level role. That means anyone in that role, any user account added to that role, has access to the entire server. They're basically the server's demigod. They can do anything, sort of like what I've been doing as administrator. And there's several other different types of administrators that allow you to give more finely tuned or more focused administrative privileges to different user accounts, all the way down to the public role. And then there's database level roles, just like we had server access via a login and then database access via a user account. Our roles are also divided server level versus database level. So giving someone, say, DB owner level or putting them in a DB owner role makes them the demigod of that database. And then there's various other administrative roles as well. We actually just use these two, data writer and data reader. But here, before we go through this PowerPoint, I'm going to take you to a Microsoft website that actually walks you through a little more detail on these roles. So I'm going to switch over to my other server and then we'll pull up the browser. There, I'm in as admin, start, server manager, and first of all, let's make sure the browser is not going to get blocked at every turn. Configure IEESC, clicking there. And I already have it turned off here. If you don't have this turned off, you probably want to if you're working on an 08 test environment. If you're in a production environment, don't turn this off. It's actually needed to help protect your box when you're online. But I don't need that in this test environment. So I'll click OK. I'm good to go here. So now I can go to MSDN. Click enter. And I must have clicked another step in there, but I think we're good to go. There's my MSDN homepage coming in. Now, server level roles. We want 2008 only, so I'll go ahead and do that. At the very top of the list, server level roles. So I'll click on that. And here's that same list we just saw over on the slide. There's that sysadmin role again. What can it do? Anything. It can perform any activity in the server, and by default, as administrator, I was added to that group. So as a result, my Windows admin had access to everything within SQL. And then there are various other administrators for more finely focused administrative tasks. I can have a server admin, someone specifically focused on security admin, someone who deals with the various processes that are running under SQL Server. So you have various admin roles, all the way down to the public role, which is kind of like the everyone role for Windows. Just like everyone logged into Windows is part of everyone. How clever of Microsoft. And in SQL Server, everyone logged into server is part of the general public and has whatever rights the public role have assigned to it. So you typically don't want a lot of rights assigned to public. Okay? If you scroll down a little bit and get into some other things and store procedures you can use with those, but we want to focus here on the database level roles. Clicking there, here's a list of my database level roles. Now, one thing I didn't mention on the other list, that other list is fixed. You may have noticed somewhere on the page it talked about fixed roles. Actually, this list is fixed as well, but you can't add any server roles. What you see is what you get. You can't make any changes to them, nor can you create new server level roles. Database level roles, however, you can create new database level roles. But by default, they give you the owner, as we saw before, can perform all configuration and maintenance activities on a specific database, including destroy the database, which means then you don't own anything anymore. But you can do that. And then there's various administrators, a security and an access admin. We have a backup operator role specifically for performing backups. And we'll get a chance to do some backups in a later video. We have a DDL admin role, allows you to run a specific set of transact SQL statements known as data definition language statements. Here's the two we used, data reader and data writer. And we could also specifically deny somebody the ability to read or write, because we have roles to do that. The MSDB database was one of our system databases, you may recall. It has its own unique set of roles that are associated with that database, and you can see those listed here. So with that, we've actually done our little discussion on users, on roles, and on permissions. So let's move back over to the slides so we can continue on. So let's jump into schemas. Schemas are about grouping our objects together so that we can manage them more effectively. We've talked about grouping users into roles, or if you're dealing with Windows, you group users into groups. But in SQL Server, we group them into roles. Well, schemas are sort of like groups, but for objects. So I can take a group of tables, or a group of views, or a group of stored procedures, or a combination of any of those, and lump them all together under a new title called a schema, and then allocate that entire set of objects, allocate access to an entity, to a user, to a role as a group. Pretty cool for managing things. Helps you keep your hair on your head as opposed to in your hands. And it's not necessarily a Microsoft invention. It didn't come out of the hallowed halls of Redmond. It's actually part of the ANSI standard. Microsoft came in line with the ANSI standard for schemas primarily during SQL Server 2005. So there isn't a whole lot that's radically changed in 08 for schemas. But once again, if I have 6 users, Ron, Ray, Kim, Mel, Sue, and Tom, 3-letter names fit nicely on those buttons, and they're all in the DB data reader and DB data writer roles, so they can all read and write to whatever database I'm working with, right? But let's say Kim and Tom also need to help administer the security for that database. I can add them to the DB security admin role as well. So now Kim and Tom have all the rights, privileges, and frustrations of the data reader, data writer, as well as the DB security admin, as opposed to the initial four, Ron, Ray, Mel, and Sue. No security admin privileges fall in their hands. They just read and write. Well, like I said, that's lumping users together. Schemas lump objects together within the database. So let's say I have a sales schema that's made up of a couple of tables, a couple of store procedures, a couple of views, and maybe even another database. I could have just any object under SQL can fall under a particular schema. Now I can allocate or remove access to the schema as opposed to the individual objects. Makes it a whole lot easier to manage as the number of tables grows from, say, 5 like we currently have in our database. Let's say I've already upped Veronica's database to include 3 more tables. So we've got the initial 5, actually there were initially 4, and we added the client flower match, and then later on we found out we needed some HR stuff. So I have a benefits table and a deductions table and an employees table and all those other kind of things you need related to HR. And the salespeople don't necessarily need to have access to that information. So by putting those in separate schemas, separate groups, separate subgroups under our database, I can allow access to one set as a whole and disallow access to another set as a whole. And just for grins, over on the right, I actually have some of the Transact SQL you could use to actually create tables using my HR schema. So I have a create table, HR.benefits, and then whatever columns that table would have. Or if I need to modify an existing table and move it from one schema to another, for example, we originally created the customer table without any thought to schemas. It was placed by default in a default schema known as DBO, standing for Database Owner. It's just a generic catch-all. If you don't tell it a schema, you're in a schema anyway. SQL Server is always using schemas, whether you want to or not. So if you choose to ignore it, it puts you in DBO, but I can move it myself using the alter schema statement. So simply saying alter schema, the new schema that I want to move things to, the keyword transfer, and then the fully qualified name with all of its parts, schema name dot object name, and it'll move that over. And the result is I get an Object Explorer that looks like the one there on the left. But let's actually try it. Let's build some of this. Let's move over to my server and give it a whirl. So let's go ahead and create some schemas. First of all, go Start, SQL Server Management Studio. I'm logging in as administrator again. And we're going to make a few changes here. File, open file, and go to that course files folder on your C drive. So when you copied it there again, video 6. And I've got another file in there, create Veronica DB with schemas. Go ahead and open that up. We'll talk about it real briefly. I added a few lines here. I'm creating a couple of schemas, a sales and HR schema. And now when I create my tables, I specifically say what schema they belong to. So my benefits, deductions, and employees tables are all in the HR schema. And then all the other tables that were in existence before, I'm saying they specifically go in sales. If I were to leave that prefix out, it would still create the table based on who I'm logged in right now. I'm logged in as administrator or a system admin, but they would belong to the DBO schema, which is like a generic system schema. In SQL Server 2008, you're always using schemas whether you want to or not. You may recall, you may have noticed earlier, our tables all had a prefix before of DBO, even though we never really mentioned it. That's because by default we're stuck in the DBO, or I should say placed in the DBO schema. So let's go ahead and recreate this Veronica database. I'll click Execute. And while that's chugging along, see if I can go faster than it can. Go Start, Administrative Tools, and if you go to Users, it looks like it succeeded okay. Got our rows of data, and it couldn't drop the database in my case because it didn't exist. In your case, you probably won't get that error. But now I want to create some new user accounts. I'm adding some people. Veronica's business is growing. We have a new HR guy. Right click on Users, go New, User, and we just hired Fred, the HR manager. And And I've been given the job of putting him in. Give him a generic password. Which he will not need to change. Hired a new salesperson by the name of Susan. She says she likes to go by Sue, so we'll put her in as Sue. Hit next. Give her generic password, which normally you would have them change later, but since they don't really exist, we'll leave it like it is. Click finish. And you know, we've been kind of cheating, going in as administrator all this time. Let's get away from that. Just kind of demo that as well. And I got MDM for Mel, the data master, as our SQL Server man in charge here. So go ahead and put him in. And we're going to give him access to both schemas. So click next. So I've got 3 new user accounts. I've got Fred, I've got MDM, and I've got Sue. So that's good. The Windows part is done. Let's come back over to SQL, and now we have to tell SQL about those accounts. Where do I start? It's the logins first. Open the security folder, right-click on logins, new login. And if I'm going through this a little quicker this time, we did this where we talked about users and roles. So I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit through it this time, but we'll still go through all the steps. Fred, that is not what I meant to type. I meant to go search, actually. Advanced. Find. And I'm going to pick him up off the list. I don't like typing if I can pull it off of a list. Click OK. That way I get the full domain name in there, and I know it's typed right. His default database should not be master. We want him defaulting to Veronica's. If we were to leave that as master, if I log in as Fred and I start doing any SQL stuff here, it will assume I want to operate against the master database unless I specifically say, as it says here, use another database, such as use Veronica. So it's just a little inconvenience, but it's no big deal. But we'll change that to Veronica's. Now, user mapping. Database of choice is Veronica's. I don't think we did this. I actually went to the user folder under the database, and that's when I pull the user account in to that database. Well, I could also assign it from here as well. And since I'm doing some stuff with schemas, I can also do that in the same screen, so I'll do them all at once. So I'm saying specifically, add Fred to the Veronica's database as a user, and change his default schema. If I leave it blank, I'm still using a schema, but I don't want to use DBO. Right? That's what I'm getting by default. He's my new HR guy. There's a little inconsistency with this screen. Checkboxes usually mean you can pick one or more options on the screen. That's not the case here. If you pick more than one, it only keeps one of them. Exactly the rule it uses on that, I'm not sure. I haven't paid much attention to it. But the bottom line, they can only have one default schema. So if you pick more than one, you really only get one. It'll even show up multiple in this list. If I go back for a second, I can pick a bunch of these. They all show up in that list, but I click OK. Only one of those actually stuck, right? So do make sure you don't fall for that thinking, oh, put him in a bunch of these. No, you can only pick one. So I'll put him back in HR where he belongs. And click OK. Fred's in. Let's go back and do Sue. Right click, new login, search for Sue. Found her, double click, OK. Change her default again. User mapping, map her to Veronica's database. Her default schema, however, will be sales. She's our hard-hitting new flower salesperson. So we're good to go there. And then third, put in my new administrator. So I'm going to stop using the administrator account at some point. Now, for our actual video, I might continue, but just point out I don't need to do that. I can create another account, MDM. Make it also the default. Make it default to Veronica's. For user mapping, put it onto Veronica's. I'm not going to change its default schema though, because remember I can only pick one on the list. I want it to stay as DBO, database owner, because I want it to have access to all the schemas. So I'm not going to touch that. Click OK. If I go over to the databases, Veronica's, expand that, go to the security folder, go to users, and there's Fred, MDM, and Sue already added in. Looks good. Now in the previous video we talked about using roles as my management tool as opposed to allowing or disallowing individual users. We want to allow or disallow a role. That way if I have a second HR person or a second or third salesperson, hopefully I will have lots of salespeople, I don't have to individually assign them access to the various things they should have access to. I just want to add them to a role, and everything else comes with the role. So the goal here is to group my users and roles and to group my resources and schemas, and from that point map the roles to the schemas. So once the role is mapped to the schema, I can later add objects to the schema or add users to the role, and they automatically get everything else that comes with the role or is a part of that schema. So we want to create a couple of new roles. Roles are specific to my database. If I expand my security folder here, I right click on roles. Now, there's two ways to do that. If I go new, there's a couple options here, or you could expand that. I'm doing specifically database roles for now. And for role, I'm going to go with V_HR. It will own the HR schema. And now I'm going to add users in to that role all on the same screen. Right after I create it, I can do that. Browse, and I have one HR guy so far, Fred. I could add MDM directly into the role, but MDM is going to have a lot more authority than that. So we're not going to put it into any specific schema or any particular role. So Fred's in my V_HR role, and that role owns that schema. Next role, V_sales. It owns sales. Add in Susan. Click OK. And for my third user, MDM, I don't need to create a role. The role already exists. I'm going to make him my database owner. All I need to do is add him into the role. So if I double click, the role's already there. Simply add to the browse here, go to MDM, and he is now a member of the database owner's role. Click OK. So all three users are set up. My database is there. Let's see what they can access. I'll go ahead and close this down. And let's start logging in. We'll start with our MDM. Start. Switch user. And I'll see you on the other side, logged in as MDM. So I'm in as MDM. Go start. All programs, SQL 08. Go to my Management Studio. This will take a few seconds to log in. And I'm in. Click connect. Well, almost in. Object Explorer, once again, first time through, it's going to take a little longer to populate. But in a few seconds, I should get a populated Object Explorer with a list of all the database objects. And since this is his first time through, he gets the lovely SQL Server ad. You can get rid of that. But now, databases. If I try and go into the report server database, no go. So this MDM user has already been brought back down to size here. He doesn't have total access anymore. But in the Veronica's database, if he goes to tables, he sees both sets, the HR stuff and the sales stuff, because he is the owner of this database. Let's switch over to, let's go with Susan first. So go to my start menu. I'm over on Susan's side now, right? Go all programs again, SQL 08, Management Studio. And get the little please wait for a few seconds. We'll fast forward past this again. Connect, this time as Susan again. And when I get to my Object Explorer, I should see sales only. Go to Veronica's, we can try this again. Report server, no access, right? It's just double checking. If I go to tables, all Susan sees is sales. So even though MDM saw everything, Susan only sees sales. And once again, first time in, so she has the little commercial. Everybody gets to see the commercial once and turn it off. So, done that. But right-click on Customers. Select 1,000 rows. And she's querying data. So she has total access to her sales subset. And we've done MDM. They had both. You've seen Susan. She has sales. And we can move over to Fred, and you'll see the same thing again. So let's do one more. So I'm in as Fred. Start. There's my Fred. So I know I'm in on the right account. Go All Programs, SQL 08. We get the little pause thing, so we'll fast forward past this a third time. I'm in, click Connect. Yes, Fred will get the commercial again as well. Everybody gets it once. Expand, go to Veronica's, go to Tables, and Fred only gets the HR stuff. So there we are. So we've managed to set up schemas and use schemas to group my database objects into subsets. Now we only did it with tables, but once again it would apply to anything. It could have been views, it could have been stored procedures, it can even be databases. Whatever we need to group into subsets so that we can manage those objects as a group. So with that, we've wrapped up schemas. So let's move back over to our slides and continue on. Jumping into protecting your data. One of the first things we'll talk about is auditing in SQL Server. SQL Server supports auditing of your login attempts. It actually supports 2 industry standards for levels of auditing, C2 as well as the Common Criteria Certifications auditing levels. But let's switch over to our server and play around with those a little bit. Go to my Start menu, bring up SQL Server Management Studio, go ahead and connect. And this time I'm going to go to the properties for the server. So I right click on the server, go to properties, and about halfway down the list there's a security menu. If I click on that, I get to see the various security options available. The very first one there is server authentication. We've talked about that one a number of times. Here's where I could change it from what I set up during my installation. I could change it to SQL Server authentication here, or actually it's called mixed mode because it allows both. Then the next one here is the auditing, login auditing. By default, SQL Server is logging all failed login attempts. I could turn that off altogether if I wanted to, but not necessarily want to do that. I could log my successful logins, or I can have it log every single login, successful or failures. Now the first one there, or the second one there, is probably a really good choice, because if someone's trying to break into your SQL Server box, just using a random password type approach, well, you're going to see a lot of failed logins showing up in your log file. There's a few other things on this page we'll talk about briefly since we're here, and then we're going to go over and look at the log file and see it get populated. But notice here, server proxy account, where I can enable a server proxy account. In some cases, application developers may require access to other resources on your server. Well, a proxy account allows you to give them access to those resources without completely opening up or giving them more access than they need to. So it's a mechanism for allowing developers greater access without giving them unlimited access. And then at the bottom here, we talked about the C2 audit tracking and the common criteria compliance. Both of those options are here. I could turn those on. And then SQL Server also supports a chaining of ownership across databases. In our particular case, we've been working with one SQL Server database, and it hasn't had to interact with any other databases. So when we dealt with permissions and ownerships and things of that nature, they were all local. But that isn't always the case. So here you can allow cross-database ownership as well. But let's go back to the logging. So I already have my failed logins showing up in my log file somewhere. So I don't need to change anything there. So let's actually create some failed logins. I'm going to log off of SQL Server. And I'm going to go back and I'll log in. But this time, well, it's going to always put me as administrator, so that can't really fail if that account is set up. But if I switch over to SQL Server Authentication, which isn't even enabled, and try and log in as George, give him a password, click OK. That one fails. He doesn't exist. But cancel out of here. And if I go to my Windows event viewer, I should see an event now for that failed login attempt. If I go to Administrative Tools, Event Viewer, go to Windows Logs, there's an application log, and SQL Server actually automatically dumps to the application log. And I'm going to group these. Actually, looks like it's right there at the top. My SQL Server login, and there it is. Login failed for George. Reason: attempt to log in using SQL Server authentication failed. The server is configured for Windows authentication only. So you get that for free. I didn't have to do any special configuration or anything. That's a default setup for SQL Server under Windows. So let's move back over to our slides and continue on. So we've talked about auditing. The next thing is configuring surface area. Now, for any of you who've worked with SQL Server for a while, basically meaning before SQL Server 2008, 05 had a tool called the Surface Area Configuration Tool. Now, what do we mean by surface area, first of all, and then second, where is this tool? Well, first of all, surface area is how much of SQL Server is available for interacting. That's your surface area. The more features you have on and enabled in SQL Server, the greater its surface area. So that's what surface area is. Now, what is the Surface Area Configuration Tool? In the SQL Server 2008 environment, it doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. It's actually been incorporated into the SQL Server Configuration Tool. In 05, there was a separate tool. So let's go find it. Going back over to my server, now the Surface Area Configuration Tool is inside of SQL Server Management Studio. So I'll go ahead and bring that up again. Go ahead and log in, and I want to again right click on my server. This time go to Facets. I'll be looking at one of the many facets of SQL Server, and on this drop down here, at the very bottom, I see my Surface Area Configuration Tool. Clicking that allows me to enable or disable blocks of functionality within SQL Server. The general rule of thumb is leave everything off that you don't need. Currently mine are all disabled, or everything set to false, because I'm not using SOAP or Service Broker or any of these additional features right now. Database mail is not enabled, or CLR integration, we talked about that a little bit, that's not enabled. Okay, so you want to leave all those things off unless you need them. Going back, next there's remote access. Now, we've done everything in a test environment using local logins, but that's very unrealistic. Most of your users will be coming into your server, accessing the data from other locations around the network or over the web. So is there anything you need to do to allow that? Yes, there is. By default, remote access is enabled. In my case, however, I'm using a firewall. So you do want to make sure you allow SQL Server access through your firewall. Now, that's a Windows setting, that's not a SQL Server setting. So you want to make that change in your Windows environment. So let's actually do that as well. Now, for everything so far, we've been doing all of our work on this server. But for this example, I have a second server that we're going to use to log in to this database server. So I'll switch over to my other server, and the backgrounds will be the only way you'll know the difference. The secondary server is going to have a white background. And from there, I'm going to bring up my SQL Server Management Studio. I've installed it over here as well. Database engine, I'm logging into that. Server name, I'm using the server name that we had before. So make sure you have the same server name here that you had before. I've logged into this server using one of my domain accounts. You may recall we created the MDM, the Mel Data Master account. So I'm logged in using a domain account that's been added to the SQL Server database over on my primary server. So with that, I should be able to get in. But there'll be quite a long delay until it finally comes back and says, you're not getting in. My firewall is going to block it. The error message, cannot connect, network related or instance specific error occurred while establishing a connection to SQL Server. It says it wasn't found or was not accessible. Unfortunately, the word firewall is nowhere in the list, but that's what the problem is. So I'll click OK to get rid of the error message, switch back over to my other server, and let's punch a little hole, very small hole, into that firewall to let our application through. Go to Start, Control Panel, Network and Internet, And there's an option here under Firewall to allow a program through the Windows Firewall. Clicking there. SQL Server is not on the list yet, but I want to add a port for it. SQL Server. SQL Server runs by default on port number 1432. Leave it at TCP as opposed to undirected data protocols. Put SQL Server on the list. Click OK. Go back to my secondary server, click Connect a second time, and I'm in a flash. So that's the other thing you want to pay attention to when you're setting up your SQL Server environment. Users will most likely be connecting from remote locations. Will they be on the other side of a firewall? If they are, you'll have to open up the port necessary for that application to connect through the firewall. So moving back over to our slides, the next topic is basic file security itself. Yeah, we're dealing with a database, but the database is simply a bunch of files saved out on the file system. How do I keep those secure? That's really up to your operating system primarily. Now, SQL Server can encrypt its files, and we'll talk about that next. But for now, you're going to install SQL Server on NTFS partition, period. Now, you can still install it on FAT, but there's really no wise reason to do that. You do want it on an NTFS partition, and you want to use any and every other standard method of protecting those files, such as RAID to protect the files in the file system. So all the standard things you do to protect any other system files, you want to apply that to your SQL Server database as well. And then there's SQL Server data encryption. Now there's lots of different ways and places you can encrypt data when you're working with a SQL Server environment. But the focus right now is the transparent data encryption, or TDE. It's a new database level encryption feature introduced in SQL Server 2008. And it's got some really good points and then some things that maybe aren't exactly perfect. Starting with the good points, it encrypts all your files. You may recall we talked about the MDF, NDF, and LDF files, your main data file, your secondary data files, and your log files. All of those are encrypted. So all your log stuff is encrypted. Any of your backups that you create, those are also automatically encrypted once you've enabled TDE. What's not encrypted? The moment it's read off of disk, SQL Server unencrypts it. So at that point, for example, anything in memory, if there's a memory dump or a crash, all of that gets dumped out unencrypted. If there's a need to do any paging, your page file could possibly contain unencrypted versions of your data. And then a third case would be any data in transit. Once it leaves the database, it's on its own. So you'll have to implement some other type of protection for the information in those cases. And then there's other stuff to know. There's always more stuff to know when you're talking about security. But let's start with the SQL Server SA login. SQL Server has a default built-in sysadmin login, simply called SA. It's analogous to the Windows Administrator account. In SQL Server 2008, however, it's not recommended you continue using the SA account. It's there for backwards compatibility primarily. You want to create user accounts for the specific tasks that will be performed in your environment and allocate to them the rights and permissions that they should have. Now, as far as what you need to do with the SA account, you should still give it a strong password, as well as possibly rename it, because it is there and could be a potential security hole. Some other things you may have noticed as we were moving around through the SQL Server environment, in the logins folder, there were some logins that had pounds in front of them. SQL Server is using all the same mechanisms that we use to create users and to manage data and to track information. It uses databases, it uses logins, it uses schemas. There are some built-in internal logins that are there for system use, internal system use only. So if you look in your login folder, you'll see some logins that are preceded by and end with pounds. Don't delete them, just leave those there. Those are for SQL Server to use for internal purposes. There is a public database role. The first two items apply to the server level, but this one applies to the database level. Every database has a role known as simply its public role. It provides your default permissions for a user if they haven't been granted anything specific or if they haven't been denied anything specific. They'll get whatever rights and privileges and permissions that the public role has. So what does that mean? You don't want to go giving much of anything to the public role. One other thing to notice here on the bottom of the screen, even though the title is public database role, here at the bottom is the application roles folder. In this case, however, the application roles are specific to applications as opposed to users. They basically work the same way, but just so you know, there is a separate folder for your application roles. And then there's the information underscore schema and the sys, which is kind of a schema as well. You'll notice many of your system objects, such as your built-in views and some of your stored procedures that are built in, will have an owner or a schema of information underscore schema or simply sys. Those are also required by SQL Server. They can't be modified. You can't drop them. You can't make any changes to them. But you can use them. You can refer to them when you want to query a database to find out things such as, give me a list of all the names of all the tables in the database or all the columns are in the database. Because once again, SQL Server is tracking all that information in tables. Well, it doesn't actually expose those tables to you because it makes use of views and schemas to organize and hide information. And those are two of the schemas that it's using. There's a guest user account. Similar to the public logon, there's a guest user on every database. Same rules apply. You want to give minimal access to the guest account. If someone comes in and doesn't have an account, there are situations where they can end up having access to your database, not in our environment because everything is using Windows authentication. But it's possible to come in as a guest, and whatever rights and permissions that you assign to that generic guest account will apply to that individual. And then last, DBO stands for database owner. DBO is the generic owner, the generic schema in the case where you haven't given a specific schema, or in certain cases, if you're part of a certain administrative group, the sysadmin group, anything you create is automatically owned by DBO. That's why when I originally created my database, all of my tables were owned by DBO. I was logged in as administrator, and the administrator is by default part of the sysadmin group. And now moving into some best practices. First of all, use NTFS. That's a given. If you're dealing with SQL Server, that's not a Mickey Mouse database. You're protecting some information that has some value. Put it on a secure file system. Same thing with protecting the physical files. You want to use RAID for your critical data files. Third, any unnecessary anything, turn it off. We talked about surface area configuration. We didn't really get into protocols, but SQL Server supports a myriad of protocols. You want to turn off any that you're not using. Fourth, run your SQL Server services with the lowest possible permissions. Fifth, associate SQL Server services with low privileged Windows accounts. Now, have we done that so far? No. I actually installed and ran everything under my Windows administrator. And I've said a few times, and I'll say it one more time. In a real world, don't ever do that unless it's your own database that's not plugged into a network anywhere and no one else has access to the box. Maybe then, but then why do you have a database, right? So you do want to create a low privileged Windows account for those services to run under. So given that we've set ours up using the administrator account, what would that look like to fix it? I'm back over on my primary SQL Server. SQL Server Configuration Manager brings up the interface. If I click on SQL Server Services, here's a list of all the services that I installed, which I basically installed everything. If I go to my primary service, SQL Server or the MS SQL Server, if I right click on that and go to Properties, one of the things on the screen is the account that it's running under. And as you can see, mine is currently running under Administrator. But I could browse here, find any other Windows account, local or domain account, and stick that in there as well. You definitely want to do that. If you didn't do it during the install, like I didn't, you definitely want to do it after you get yourself up in production. Moving on to best practice number 6, and I actually mentioned this one already, dealing with the SA account. Rename it, assign a strong password to it, period. You can't delete it, it's always there, but you do want to at least close it up tight. So you want to change that and make it a little more secure. Number 7, only turn on what you need. We talked about that before as well, but the Surface Area Configuration Manager was one example of that. And also just simply not installing everything. Like I just showed you, I have every single service running, but I'm not using all of those possibly. Don't install all of those. And then last but not least, make sure you're using Windows authentication. You're not going to need to use the SQL Server authentication unless you're in an environment with clients that are non-Windows. If you're in a Windows environment, then you're fine with the Windows authentication. That even applies to web-based applications, because you might say, well, if I have my SQL Server servicing a website, I don't know what the client, the ultimate user, is using. That doesn't matter, because in that case, the person sitting on the other side of the browser is not your actual user as far as SQL Server is concerned in most cases. In some cases, you may need to build an application where the end user is actually hitting the database, but that's a little different. In that case, you may have an argument for SQL Server authentication, but in most cases, your Windows authentication is going to cover you. Speaking of coverage, what did we actually cover? Well, first of all, we spent some time talking about logins and setting up some logins, and then we took and mapped those logins to users. The difference, the logins let you into the server, the users got you into a specific database. Next, we got into schemas and talked about how we use schemas to help organize the objects under a database. We talked about roles, which is the SQL Server equivalent of groups. There were 2 types of roles that we played with, and the third type we briefly mentioned, but there were database roles. What roles do you play within a specific database? Server roles, what roles can you play server-wide? And then I briefly mentioned also application roles, which are used by applications to give an application access to a database. Next, built-in logins. We talked about those a little bit. We got into the guest account. We got into the public role. We talked about some of the system roles and system schemas that are created. We looked at SQL Server's interaction with a firewall and how important it is to configure a firewall when you're dealing with SQL Server. And we showed you how audits work within SQL Server and some changes you can make to audits. Looking at my list of new terms, there's about 9 of them or so. But logins versus users. Now, neither one of those are really new terms, but the way they're used in SQL is a little different. In many environments, the terms are interchangeable. In SQL Server, they have a very precise meaning. Logins apply to the server, get you into the server. Users apply to the database. They get you into the database. And you don't get to the database until you get through the server. So for an end user to have access to the database, they have both. Now, do they log in twice? No, as you have just seen. We link them, so to speak, inside the server. So they simply present their Windows login, and SQL Server maps them through the server and onto their database. The second one there, database role. Roles are like groups for Windows. Server roles are server-wide groups or server-wide rights. There are built-in server roles in SQL Server. Number 3, database roles, same thing, but these apply to a specific database. There are built-in database roles, and you can create additional ones as well. Number 4, there are also application roles for allowing applications to access SQL Server. Number 5, we talked about schemas. That's not a SQL Server only concept. They are ubiquitous throughout database land, but it's a way to group database objects for manageability. So roles group applications or users so you can apply rights and permissions to them as a group. Schemas group the objects inside the database. So when I go to give access to a thing, I can give access to more than just a table or a column. I can give access to a whole set of objects, a group of tables, and store procedures as a unit. Number 6, the built-in SA account, it just doesn't go away. That's your built-in system administrator login. My recommendation on that was, once again, change the password, make it a strong password, and possibly even rename it. Number 7, DBO, database owner, is what that stands for. All objects under SQL Server have an owner. In many cases, you can end up, or I should say, the default owner, if you log into the server as a member of the sysadmin group, the default owner is the generic DBO owner or database owner. If you want another owner, you have to specifically say so, or you can also change the ownership later. Number 8, surface area. It's basically the enabled features in your SQL Server environment, and you want to minimize your surface area because by doing so, you minimize your points of attack. And then number 9, we talked about C2 as well as common criteria certifications, which are simply auditing specifications that are supported by SQL Server. Things you should know how to do. First of all, we should be able to allow users and applications managed access to SQL Server resources. Second, using schemas to manage SQL Server objects. Again, SQL Server groups objects under schemas so we can allocate user rights to the group as opposed to a single individual object. And then third, we looked at auditing so we can track, and you should be able to track user logins and attempted logins or failed logins. And with that, that brings us to the end of our video on configuring SQL Server 2008 security. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.